questions from the audience and opportunities for conversation here. I would ask that you introduce yourself and that you ask a question. I don't think we have a lot of time for a lot of statements, so if you can kind of keep it brief, that would be great. I'm going to take 2 or 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll turn it back to the panel, and then we'll keep going back and forth. So, questions? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. My name is Nouri Jernoun. I teach here at the CCIS. My first question to Dr. Ali, you talked about mercenaries used by, I don't know, by the regime killing people. Can you please elaborate about that? Who recruited them? Who paid them? My second question, short question to Dr. Baker. So you talked about neoliberalism. I agree with you, neoliberalism, maybe we disagree about where it will be buried, but I think born in Chile, and I think likely will be buried in Chile with what's going on there. My question is how those neoliberal policies strengthen traditional elites in Iraq. You talked about neoliberalism, but mainly sectarian elites. They reproduce the same system, almost the same system in the post-2003. Many polls organized in the aftermath of 2003, they showed that Iraqi want the state back, a kind of social democracy. What we had is a kind of distorted neoliberal democracy. Your Excellency, you made a parallel between South Africa and Iraq. To my knowledge, the South African state in post-1993 still there. The state didn't collapse. There were no occupation in South Africa.
And sorry, I just said that the same team organized the elections. Well, that's all I said.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is factually correct.
Thank you.
A few more questions?
Sure. Do I need to stand up too?
You don't have to.
Oh, yes, I do. My name is Grace Benton. I graduated from the Arab Studies program a couple of years ago, and now I'm a 3rd year at the law school, also at Georgetown. So you guys all underscored a number of different challenges that Iraq and Iraqis face, and sort of what these protests are about and responding to, and really trying to seek to address some of these issues. You all sort of talked in varying sort of levels of detail about the Daesh takeover, and I think Dr. Becker, you mentioned specifically sort of the wave of forced displacement that accompanied the forced Daesh takeover. But something I'm really curious about is how how this massive wave of forced displacement, I think at its height over 3 million people were living, outside of their homes, how sort of forced displacement generally fits into some of the challenges that the protesters are seeking to respond to. And also perhaps, is it useful to think about displaced persons themselves as kind of agents of change within the context of this most recent wave of protests?
We're going to do these 3 right here. We're going to do these 3 right here, Grant, Aram, and you, and then we'll turn it back over, and then I'll go through another round of questions.
Great. I'm Graham Pitts. I'm a fellow here in the center. There was lots of this tension between pessimism and optimism was present in all your talks. What kind of positive vision for the future do these protesters have, and what historical templates are they looking for to imagine a positive future? Thank you.
Yes, I'm Aran Keshvarzian. I teach at NYU, but I'm in DC this year. I had 2 questions. Came up in different ways in a number of the papers that 2013 seems to have been an important kind of juncture where things, even on the graphs, kind of took a different turn. As someone who's unfortunately quite ignorant about Iraq, I was wondering if you had if 2013 was monumental, as it obviously could be related to the Daesh, the emergence of Daesh and the war there, but maybe there's other issues related to displacement. And then, as someone who follows the neighboring country, Iran's press, in the last couple of years, there's been a fair amount of articles about in Iran about Iranians working in especially Basra, but other parts of Iraq as well, southern Iran, as well as Iraqis who go to Iran for healthcare, health tourism, and Zahra Ali's paper especially really had a very nice kind of class reading of this. So I was just wondering if, to get beyond the kind of Iran capturing, colonizing Iraq, could we think about the relationship between Iran and Iraq in a kind of a class lens, especially because of the ongoing consequences of the U.S. sanctions on Iran, having in a sense reverberating through the political economy relations between Iran and Iraq.
Hi, thank you for a lot of interesting points, first of all. My name is Thea Anderson, and I was a part of the Norwegian mentor team to the Iraqi armed forces last year in Anbar province, which means I was there when the Basra protest footage was rolling over the screens. And I remember asking a very influential brigadier general how his view was on the younger generation, if he was optimistic or not. And he kind of looked at me and said, you have to remember that this generation has experienced nothing but war and corruption. How are they supposed to create something that they've never seen? And so it seems from your talks today that they have been much more successful now in contesting the state than they maybe were in last year in Basra, but also that there are some issues with social mobility still. How do you see the younger generation's ability to participate in the state building process?
I don't envy you the task, but some fantastic questions from our audience. And I think we should just have each of you address questions as you want. And
I think if I could just tackle that last one, because I think it's they can't change the system if the system's stacked against them, right? You know, I think your question is looking at here what's happening, and there's people's grievances, and they're very articulate about their grievances. They know what they want, and they know what the problem with the system is, which is, this is what I'm hoping the Iraqi government will actually heed to, because they're telling the government what they want and what they've seen that isn't working. How can they be engaged in a process that doesn't include them, right? It's impossible unless there's some serious structural and institutional changes that take place that start kind of looking a lot more endogenously at constitutional, reform, at electoral reform, at the distribution of electoral quotas, and what should be technocratic allocations, and kind of moving away from proportional allocations based on sectarian quotas, which is what the Muhassasa system. And what all of that will do is it will tell, I talked about the HDI, looking at the Human Development Index, and where, looking at Iraqis born now, a projection of 18 years down the line where they will be, right? It's not good. I mean, the next generation of Iraqis will have less upward mobility and less economic and social opportunity because of the lack of investment in education, both elementary, tertiary, and secondary, right? And this goes both for the region as well as the central government, as well as a lack of, in terms of even technical and professional training, right? These youth are left out of the state development model. That has to kind of completely be re-envisioned, right? Tweaked, maybe even, because it's there, it just has to be tweaked. Which is why it's actually, in many ways, it's good that the constitution is fluid. It's not so set. If we look at like constitution in Bosnia, where there's a deep constitutional corporate system that's put in place, it's a little harder to change. But Iraq can benefit from it because it means that there are mechanisms by which the constitution can be changed. Change just has to come.
So thank you for the question. Regarding the mercenaries, I'm not a judge, and there will be a so-called investigation. I'm not really hopeful around what's going to come out of it, but what is being I can talk about what is being said in the street, in the Iraqi street, is that many Iraqis, I've seen, hundreds of videos circulating within the civil society in Iraq among the different people who were there, and especially, and this is why I made this class distinction, and I hope I was clear. I think that what happened at the very start, the first demonstration, straight away the Iraqi authorities wanted to get rid of it, right? So it was extreme violence. It was extremely brutal, right? We had like over 100 people, like around some numbers. The Iraqi Observatory for Human Rights talk about around 150 people dying in a week, right? Over 6,000 wounded, right? And so the Iraqi street is talking about, the use of mercenaries in the sense that you see videos of, especially the week after, but even during this first week, even policemen have been shot by these mercenaries. You see also videos of Iraqi soldiers not really sure what to do, and some of them expressing support with the demonstrators and not agreeing at all with the brutal repression, right? So in the street, what people say is that it's Iran back. This is how the Iraqi streets interpret. There are a lot of videos on social media. For example, the last video that was really being shared, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of times was in the case of an Iranian man in the middle of, I think it was Al-Basra, that was actually caught by protesters. And the video, the demonstrators were saying, look, he's from Iran, he doesn't even speak Arabic, as like the proof of what's going on. Regarding the question of the displaced, and what's going on in Mosul, I think, again, I'm going to go back to my kind of ethnography within civil society. And also to maybe relate it to the other questions. I think that what happens, despite all the destruction that you've been talking about, from the point of view of the civil society, a lot of things have been developing, right? So we're not in the stage, so as I said, first demonstrations happened straight after the invasion, women's movement get organized, etc. After, of course, we fall into a sectarian war or civil war, whatever you call it, but we fall into 2 years, 2006, 2007, of extreme violence that really reshaped the political scene, reshaped also the social life. If you look at Baghdad, how Baghdad has been divided according to ethno-sectarian belongings. Some numbers talk about 65% of the population in Baghdad moving either in another neighborhood in Baghdad or outside of Baghdad, in some place inside Iraq or outside of the country. So reshaping really happened, right? But at the civil society level, straight away, and this is why I mentioned the fact that in 2009, a lot of even scholars don't know that there were protests in 2009, right? And I think it's important, when we talk about civil society resilience as well, that people got organized. And more, slowly after the years, we reached 2011. Of course, the invasion of Daesh, pushed us into another crisis, right? But I think this is when certain things, and talking about imaginaries as well is very important. Many protesters, many members of the civil society today, the way, the kind of vocabulary they use, the terminology they use, wasn't created, last month, right? It was really the produce of the development of strong social movements. If you look, for example, at union organizing, professional union in the private and in the public sector is extremely strong throughout across the country, right? You have youth organizing, the kind of generation that I think really led to what's going on today. So in Najaf, for example, I followed a movement or a network of activists called Moje, who have been very active in helping the displaced, for example, who have been very active in many concrete action to tackling, cross-sectarian partnership, right? Interface kind of understanding of المواطن العراقي, like the being an Iraqi, right? And I think that, of course, these activists belong mostly to the middle class, are mostly educated, and I think that the shift that is going on today is that we're having a way younger, a way more working class, less educated people who are in the front line, I think. Now the movement it's a general uprising, as I said. But we cannot, I think, understand it without looking at really the investment of individual, of groups, human rights advocates, feminists, women's rights advocates, throughout these years following the 2009 to today. I think that's very essential to understand. And also I really like the fact that Youssef talked about and insisted on the sanction because clearly what the protesters are asking, I mean, what I read in Read Watan, we want a homeland, is we want a state, right? And this state has been destroyed during the sanctions. And this state has to, I mean, rebuild itself, right? And I think that that's, I mean, like you said, Youssef, looking at it also through a transnational perspective is very essential because we're really moving away. Protesters in Tahrir Square today are saying we're not going to be we're not going to be appropriated. Our struggles are not going to be appropriated by the communist parties or by any party, leftist or non-leftist or nationalist. We are tackling concrete issues, and we want these issues to. I mean, we want our demand to be implemented, basically. So I think it's important to realize how much the very destruction of the state is still at the center of what's going on today.
So we have problems. I want to tell you that I was supposed to leave at 2, but this has been fascinating, so I canceled the meeting to stay. I feel like a patient who's been gone to a checkup. Much of what you say is true, all of you. But I think what you need to realize is that the conditions in Iraq are intrinsically difficult. You know, every year we have 1 million new people. Find jobs for these. How can you do that? Okay, if we had a really weak, inefficient state, you know, some sort of private sector would emerge. But we still have a state with laws that actually prevent the private sector from creating these jobs. So that's our conundrum. We have a state that is not doing what's required, but is still powerful enough to prevent the private sector from doing what's required. And that's exactly where we are. And there are issues that are coming very quickly down the pike that we will have to confront. Just a couple of days ago, I noticed this article in the New York Times that looked at the rise of seawater, you know, and in 2050, Basra will be underwater. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was the only Iraqi president at Kyoto. I'm the guy who put the adhesion to the Climate Change Convention on the Iraq Compact. It was a really close issue to me. In 2006, I was sitting next to a parliamentarian on a plane from Amman to Baghdad, and he was from Basra. And I told him about the threats to Basra. And he says, oh my God, this is really scary. But one question for you, when will this happen? Before or after the next elections? Okay, and so this is the problem. We have to address these very quick issues that have to satisfy the needs, immediate needs of this young generation. But at the same time, to look far ahead and not to do things that will put us in an even more difficult situation. The Hashid itself is an answer to this. In 2014, we had nothing. You know, we basically were. I mean, there are reasons for that, and that's a completely different problem. We'll have to look into it at some point. But the Iraqi army collapsed. ISIS was very close to Baghdad, very close to Erbil. What could we do? I mean, the Iranians came in, they helped us. The Americans were sort of standoffish for a few months. And then Sistani saved the day by creating the Hashid. So now we have to be very, and this is what I'm trying to say, is that we have to be very careful not to implement quick measures, okay, for which we'll have to pay a price later on. But I'm still optimistic about it.
I can talk about the questions about the visions for the future and the youth, which I think sort of tie into each other. So these, like Shamran said, I've written about this. I've written about the sense of nostalgia for authoritarianism, not just in Iraq, but in so many places in the world. And research has shown that it comes from two things. Not living under authoritarianism makes you think of it as better than it is, and also living under bad democracy makes you have higher expectations because of the rhetoric of democracy. So the roots are understandable of why there is a nostalgia for authoritarianism. But I think what is also available to this generation that was not available to the previous one was the internet and this is very obvious. They can see what's going on in the rest of the world. They have models. Just because they didn't live under this government, under an authoritarian government, doesn't mean that they can't perceive what different types of governance can be. And so I think this has honestly made a difference in the way that this particular generation is protesting. And one of the ways you can see that happening right now is if you look at the parallels between Lebanon and Iraq. In terms of the parallels between the ways protesters are actually they're parroting each other in some way back and forth across the two countries, and you can tell where that's coming from. I mean, these chants from Beirut in solidarity with Baghdad, the chants in Baghdad in solidarity with Beirut, shows that the world is more interconnected in this way, and so allows for building visions in a way that may have not been possible for previous generations. That being said, there's a tension for me as a political scientist to look at the demands of the protesters and to look at experiences of other countries and how uprisings, protests have been successful in implementing change. And exactly as the ambassador mentioned, this trade-off between band-aid solutions for now versus what hole are we digging for ourselves in the future. So the protesters they have demands that are clear. They want an election, a new one. They want a new electoral law. They want the dissolution of provincial councils. And some of them have other demands, and there isn't really a central authority that I can call to and say this is a central protesting authority that has these demands, but these are the common themes that are placed throughout. It's not the people's job to really set up how to create a state. I think them asking for a change is really what a citizen is supposed to do. They're neither politicians nor political scientists nor policymakers, so it's not really incumbent upon them to create a road plan for the future. If they do, that's amazing, but I try to keep that in mind. I think the role of a lot of academics, if asked, is to be able to create this roadmap that calls upon other cases and other experiences of transition in order to support Iraq. Like we keep saying, and I think this is the optimistic thing about this panel, Iraq is not exceptional in a good way. So that's what we hope for.
I disagree. Iraq is exceptional.
It's not exceptional. We can have a longer conversation. It's not exceptional in a very good way. The food is
It's an
exceptional.
exceptional.
Yeah. The question about Iran and social class. So this might not exactly get to your question, but I have done a very interesting project on the impact of pilgrims on the formation of civil society, actually, and not civil society in the Zahra sense, but civil society in the this is classy civil society. Civil society in the sense of just people getting together and basically expressing themselves, and looking at the impact of pilgrimages to the cities of Karbala and Najaf, which have a huge Iranian component, the way that really fits into the economic well-being of the cities, how it has really built them in specific ways, and how it has led to certain types of the correlation isn't between the Iranians themselves and what happens in Karbala and Najaf, but between the act of the pilgrimages and the visitors and sort of the transnational reach of these cities, and sort of building the social capital of the local communities who are constantly exposed to these activities. So there are a lot of ties between Iran and Iraq that have nothing to do with militias and clerics, and just it's a many-layered relationship. And so I just wanted to bring this up because this is one of the interesting things that has come from these pilgrimages, I think.
Couple of things. So then, sorry, I forget your name, sir. But I think the question was, how did the neoliberal policies re-entrench the elites in Iraq? So, in answering the question, so for me, neoliberal policies neoliberalism is a goal, is a means, and is a metaphor. As a goal, it's about a world that is governed by the market, protected by governments. As a means, it's all of the various kinds of austerity measures and all of those things that you see. And as a metaphor, it's the business as a way to live. So like, you're supposed to be an entrepreneur, you're supposed to be a businessman. Those are, you absorb the individualistic business model where you yourself, you're homo economicus, as Wendy Brown talks about. So that neoliberal policies, in the way that it has re-entrenched the elites during at least the occupation, and this is the time when neoliberal policies were set in place in Iraq, close to a third of the orders and regulations that Paul Bremer put in place a third of them were economic. And those third are the ones that are still in place, a lot of them, right? So if you look at in terms of who's one of the most fundamental actors in Iraq after the US invasion, you have to say it's Paul Bremer, in terms of setting out the juridical landscape. So as part of that, you had decentralization. Decentralization was talked about as a way of promoting democracy. But really, when you couple decentralization with this kind of lack of governance structures, in which you don't know what the difference between a region, a province, and a central government is, what you've created is all kinds of ways in which you could evade policies, regulations, in order to go to where you need to go. Right, so so in terms of if the reach of capital, you could circumvent the state in some ways. It also opened up the borders of Iraq drastically right away. That in one swoop, devastated, like whatever there was left of Iraq's manufacturing, just kind of went away. Because how are you going to compete with products, by the way, that were coming from the regional power? So it was like the Iranian air conditioners, right? Those were all over Iraq, and that's something that, as the sanctions regime on Iran is ratcheted up, the Iranian capital goes to Iraq as a place to kind of unload or accumulate. And so in that sense, the key then becomes the state actors, the political elite, they become either interlocutors or themselves the businessmen. So Barham Saleh was really into construction up north, right? And he was the minister of planning when he gave the priority, like, you know, who's going to set up the economic project for Iraq? He gave it to the planners in the United States to come up with. So in that sense, they become the interlocutors, so then they get a cut, or they themselves become the very people who do those investments, and so then those elites have become re-entrenched through the way in which the government has been opened up through neoliberal policies. And so, you know, in a sense, yeah, so I'll say that. In terms of, I think Gracie asked a question about, Grace Benton, about forced displacement and what happens to the displaced people. I don't know, so is one answer, but what I would say is that what you see in other parts of Iraq that I think analytically at least could be applied in this case is places like Sadr City. So Sadr City is what I think the third or second largest slum in the world. But Sadr City is also a place of massive political upheaval, political deliberation and conversation. And I think there, for me, the analytical lens that I always use is Asif Bayat's notion of, the sociologist, his notion of non-government, non-movement movements, or the collective actions of non-collective individuals, as then setting up the social infrastructure, really, that then when, you know, because when you have like Tahrir Square now, and all of a sudden you're seeing coordination, then people popping up, and you got like a little media thing, well, that doesn't just come out of nowhere. The social infrastructure for that, for me, I see it in the non-movement movement in places like Sadr City, where that intimate interdependence between people is created that then could become politicized or could become directed into the, you know, the normal way we understand political movements, which is protest or things like that. So how does that, is that happening with folks who are displaced? I think you need ethnographic work that I just don't have. And in response to Arang's point about Iran, so I mentioned one is the capitalist class in Iran in terms of unloading in Iraq. The other place, I think for me, the Hausa and the religious establishment in Iraq, especially some of the leading ones, are a major capitalist class fraction in Iraq. So that you see that in their operations in terms of who is accumulating the wealth that's coming from the religious tourism, who is the interlocutor for Iranian reconstruction of places like Karbala. I mean, Karbala has been completely redesigned, right? It's because the shrine now is built like the Mashhad, where you have the Imam Reza shrine that is 2 layers, on the bottom there's cars, on the top. So there's similar things are envisioned in Iraq, and then that is dislocating kind of the historic people that were the Bazaris that were around. And so this is Iranian capital coming in close with also then the religious establishment. This is I don't know if it's a good answer, but I think it's getting and then you have working class Iranians who go to travel to Iraq because it's cheap and religious tourism in that sense, and middle class Iraqis who go to Iran for services, especially health. So I think that movement really belies kind of this myth that we have of the borders that somehow have become sedimented amongst us. Because really, that is how Iran and Iraq operated all the time. And it's been the entrenchment of the borders between Iran and Iraq have been a recent phenomenon of the Baghdad Pact and onward from both Iraqi and the Iranian state perspective. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and in some ways that's the tragic thing of what's happening in Iraq and elsewhere, in that it reshapes our historical memory to believe that what is now has been there before, and that's at the end of the day is the problem of nationalism, is that it's historically and theoretically impoverished. And so I'm in some senses, I'm hoping that what you see in the protest and in the sophistication of the young people is to go to Graham's point about positive imaginaries. I'm hoping that the imaginaries that we go back to is not liberal democracies of Europe, but rather the movements and how people lived within the region itself and the political ideas that were existent in those places, whether you're talking about the Iraqi Communist Party or the Islamists or others. I think there is a lot there that has become bastardized into just pure sloganeering that has turned people against those ideas when in fact they had a lot of substance that need to be dealt with. So for me, I see hope in the things that were being produced by people there in different moments in time. So, there's something to say about the Third World Project emanates from the Middle East as well as other places. So, and that was it's a different type of world-making idea, and so that's where I see positive imaginaries. And the last thing that I want to say is in terms of the violence of the state against the protesters, I see that as the weakness of the Iraqi state again. I mean, from a Gramscian understanding, the more coercive the state is, the weaker hegemony is. And so the Iraqi elite and the Iraqi state just don't have a lot of maneuverability. So you don't see the same type of violence in Lebanon, because given Lebanon's terrible state and structure, there's still more maneuverability for the elite. So you don't have to resort to violence. In Iraq, I think there isn't a lot of maneuverability. So you do feel like, oh, this could mean tremendous change, so we have to tackle it now. And so, you put that with all of the other problems, and that could become fertile kind of ground for violence.
So, do any of our panelists have to leave? I know some of you have planes and trains and buses scheduled. If you have time, I think I would like to take one more round of questions and then one more round of answers. That's okay? Okay. I just know we've gone way over. And if any of you all need to leave as well, of course. Okay, so questions. We have 1, 2. Any others? Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Mary Lynn. I was just wondering what you guys thought about how the resignation of Abdelmaki, what that does to placate the demands of the protesters, and how realistic the calls for early elections are, and what that elections play out?
Douglas Oliver, I've got a long history with Iraq. I've been thinking about Iraq as a particularly nasty case of transition from authoritarian rule for a long time now. But I think unlike most of those cases where you have a regime that is honestly trying, however incompetent it might be and however it might be, trying to divert most of the rents to certain subclasses, usually everyone's pulling together on making the regime work. I think Iraq is unusual in the number of actors that are actively trying not to make the regime work. Whether that's those with nostalgia for the prior regime, whether that's the militias, whether that's, as you pointed out, an extremely empowered region that is extremely vested in it doing well, and conversely in the capital not doing so well, so it looks better by comparison, or whether that's a really nasty neighbor next door that likes having a dysfunctional buffer state. I can't think of any parallel in the literature to someone having all of these. Narco states have problems, Lebanon has Hezbollah, but I can't think of someone with all of these in one place. So how does that impact our hopes of, kind of pairing with the earlier question, the hopes for earlier elections, for something different, when you have so many active groups, powerful groups trying to sabotage actually having the state function?
You're asking the core question here.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I think there are no more questions, so I think we can end with this, and if you can all sort of take this on as you want, and then we'll wrap up and let you all have a rest.
Going back to Mary Lynn, your question, and Douglas, your question, I think they actually kind of resonate. You can have Mahdi resign, but if there are no serious changes that are concretely concretely promised, but the action items by which that change can actually be implemented. It's one thing to say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to inject this stimulus, whatever. It's another to say, I'm going to create task force A that's going to look into the deaths of these protesters. Task force B, I'm going to set up a system in place, which goes to your question, how do you demilitarize, demobilize, and reintegrate, which is so key, right? It's been done actually in more complex societies. Think of Colombia. Nobody thought, it's not perfect, and it's up and down, but nobody thought that the FARC would even come to a negotiating table with the Colombian government. Nobody. Nobody that looks at that conflict for the past 50 years thought that would happen. In the case of Iraq, it's much newer, right? And there's a vested interest in terms of the regional alignment to make that happen domestically. And so it's not just about promising that there's going to be another election or that somebody else is going to take place, but there has to be concrete action items to tackle all of these things that we've mentioned, but all of the things that actually the protesters themselves are mentioning, right? We get caught up in the romanticization of the protesters and the protests. Oh my God, Iraqis are up in arms and they're awake. It's the Arab Spring 2.0. This is a headline that I read recently. Why is it 2.0? I mean, people have been protesting since the time of state formation in the Arab world, right? What's 2.0 about this? And it's the same with Iraq, right? And so there has to be tangible, actionable items of how all of these things can actually be tackled, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, right? No democracy consolidated overnight. If we look at wave after wave of democracy, in fact, even the American democracy isn't fully consolidated yet, right? And so that's another thing. Sorry? Don't say that on the hill, maybe. But the other thing I wanted to bring in about the regional dimension is actually also the asymmetric, the asymmetry behind the political economy of Iraq itself, and how farmers are not integrated into the national system. There is a concrete preference that was put in place post-2003 that favored Iraq. I mean, imagine this is the cradle of civilization, with really farmers who know what they're doing for generations, and this knowledge was produced over time, right? That was wiped away in favor of this bigger political economy project that would see the importation of goods, especially of agricultural goods, into Iraq, at the same time subverting the Iraqi agricultural sector. If we look at the Kurdistan region, for instance, what is the KRG's largest trading partner? It's Turkey. You go to the north, at least the area where my family comes from, the Assyrians in that region have been known for generations as being the best apple farmers and producers that produce, like at some point, produced the biggest thriving apple sector in Iraq. They now have, you know, hundreds of orchards, of apple orchards, but no marketplace where they can sell their apples. Why? Because they go to KRG officials and they say, no, thank you, our apples are imported from Turkey. And forget about getting your apples from the very far north of Iraq down to Baghdad, right? This is a loss, and the same thing is happening amongst farmers in Mosul and in the kind of agricultural hub of the country, which is the Nineveh Plains. The exact same thing is happening. These farmers are not able to access these markets because there's an importation of goods that subverts the local economy, right? That has to change too.
So, if I may, on the resignation, there's one thing that needs to be pointed out. One has to ensure the continuity of the state. And in the way the Iraqi government functions, it is really shackled by the rules and regulations that it's implemented. And so there is a clear difference between the capacities and the prerogatives of a government in place and a caretaker government. And I think one of the things that concerns the Prime Minister is that if he moves and resigns, by the time they will appoint a replacement, he will act as a caretaker with reduced powers, authorities, what have you. To me, this is a real concern. For example, many of the things I have to follow up on here are cases of legislation that we have to hire lawyers to defend Iraq, which means that we have to pay them, which means that money has to come from Baghdad, which means that decisions have to be made to do that. If the ministries aren't empowered to do this, then we don't get the money, and then we lose the cases, and we lose the ministries. So the importance of the continuity of the state has to be underlined, and that's one of the things I think that made the Prime Minister say that I will resign once my replacement is known. This way, you can ensure that there is a sort of a continuity of the state. One thing that you raised, Shamar, about agriculture. What happened in terms of our interactions with our neighbors in terms of imports and exports was really catastrophic in 2003, 2004. And we killed our agriculture and we killed our industry. Now, the unfortunate thing is that right now this agriculture is on the mend. Last year was a remarkable year because of the war situation. And we had such a bumper crop of wheat that we did not know what to do with it. And one of the nicest stories that I used to tell before, October 1st, and that's in fact a nice case of economies of scope. What they do with the tea walls that they removed from Baghdad? Well, one bright engineer decided that we could use these to manufacture makeshift silos to store the excess wheat that we got this year. And what the government did was that they bought all of them out, and they immediately paid the farmers, and so that they can spend immediately for next year's crop. At least we're sure that we'll have enough bread for the continued future.
Just a quick note. I think those were good answers to the question. The one note that I want to make in terms of what Doug you mentioned, I don't necessarily think Iran wants an unstable Iraq. I think it wants a stable Iraq because it has power in Iraq and it wants to keep that power. It also wants a stable Lebanon. I mean, that's how I read Khamenei's statement that he came out with, was that, yeah, I support the protesters, but go within the legal channels. Because in a sense, they don't want to alter the shape that it's in. And of course, just like as in Saddam, stability doesn't mean good things, but Iran in a sense wants a stable regime that is friendly to it and it could do its bidding. So I think that's one point. And so then in one of the issues, and I think it's important to mention this because we're sitting in the United States and not in Iraq, is that the regional game needs to be changed. And the only people that could do that, the only actor that could do that is the United States. I mean, with the nuclear negotiations in Iran, when you undermine that, you have repercussions for the entire region, not just in Iran. I mean, what the Obama administration did in putting pressure on the Saudis and the Iran, and then getting the agreement with Iran, moves towards a place in which you calm the situation down throughout the region. But instead, now you go back. I mean, like, you know, there is an incomprehensible policy on the part of the United States that says there needs to be regime change in Iran, and then, you know, there shouldn't be a regime change in Saudi Arabia because they're cool. And so then, because of the way that they create these policies that are nonsensical, they're not rational, they're passionate, really, then, you know, you set up the entire region in a way in which the incentive structure is built against kind of moving towards a more harmonious situation. So that this is a huge problem. You know, you could resolve this. You could resolve this by the United States going and saying, Iran, we're going to take off regime change. And then forcing Saudis and the Iranians to come to the table and trying to squash their beef and putting pressure on the Saudis. And you could do the same thing with the Israelis. I mean, the Obama administration was moved to that in a sense. And that could alter dramatically what's happening in the region. Now I say that, and I know that the United States is not going to do that. So, I mean, part of the problems that we have over there stems from over here. The distinction between over here and over there is an illusion. It's not actually real. A lot of things that happen over there occur because of hallways over here. What people do in hallways over here. Backwards.
Yeah, I mean, I will actually follow up on what you're saying about over there and over here, being somebody who really theorizes around feminist transnational modes of approaching, I mean, social movements, civil society, etc. And definitely, I mean, sociologists, I mean, many people have been saying that since the Arab uprising, we are living a post-Islamist moment, and I think in Iraq it is definitely the case. In Lebanon, even when, I mean, people are saying, even Hassan Nasrallah is being criticized in Iraq, many people say it's the end, and actually the basis of Muqtada Sadr, which is kind of, let's say, the equivalent if we want to compare with Lebanon, with different histories, of course, but in terms of Sha'biyya, the popularity of among a certain generation, among young people, and many people, I mean, it's kind of obvious now that the social base of the Sadris is now on the street and doesn't want the Sadris to get involved anymore, right? So not only we're living in post-Islamist moments, we're living in a post-identity politics moment, but I think there is something very important in raising the transnational dimension of what we're talking about, of things happening in Chile, in Haiti, in Algeria, etc. And also here, right, is environmental, the centrality of environmental issues, and that was very clear in Basra, talking again about, and you mentioned, I mean, what you actually mentioned is that the toxicity of everyday life is, of course, related to the lack of infrastructures and etc., but is also now being very, I mean, the toxicity of oil extraction. We're not going to answer the future of the political economy of Iraq in just redistributing all resources. Oil itself is problematic. Oil is toxic. Oil is I mean, this extraction, this mode of economy is causing so many cases of cancer every single day in Iraq and in other places, right? So I think that maybe the positive aspect and the change that I see is that because everything is now going on at the same time, like I'm kind of hoping that there might be a transnational sort of imaginary that will come out. And like you said, Marcin, the enormous difference that is so obvious that we have to mention is the fact that yes, Iraq is open now. We have internet, and we've seen that if you look at Tahrir Square, there are so many things that are talking to the other squares in the region, but also in terms of so many so many issues. I mean, I'm very focused on talking about women's rights, etc. But I see boundaries being crossed now. But I also think that this openness, the fact that people know what's going on everywhere, right, really influence the imaginary and the way they formulate their demands. So I think we need also as scholars to think maybe more deeply in terms of like the centrality, because we talk a lot about many of us are inspired by the Marxist tradition, and this is also, I mean, the history of the left everywhere, and we are kind of caught up now. Even when I saw, for example, in the US, the enormous demonstration of young people who are way younger than me, right, around environmental issues, I feel very old because I feel, oh, this is not how we formulate things. This is not how we used to get organized, and I think this is something that is going to be, I mean, posed at the transnational level, and that we need to think about. Yes, we're talking about racial capitalism. Yes, we're talking about colonial capitalism, patriarchal capitalism. But there is something that is also, I mean, really central is, I mean, the environment dimension of every single, I mean, of each category that we are talking about.
I would like to thank you, Ambassador, for being here and for sharing with us your ideas, and also for staying with us to listen to these brilliant scholars. I think that's a credit to you, so thank you. Thank you to the audience for listening and being here, and really thank you to the panel and for the Institute of Iraq Studies for sort of organizing this. So good afternoon, everyone.